Well, welcome and good morning, good afternoon. We're excited to have your participation in today's Strategy Huddle. My name is Ryan. I'm an account and product manager here at MyStrategicPlan. The purpose of this call, the Strategy Huddle, as always, is to talk strategy, to talk execution, and to address some real-world questions and provide some ideas and actionable solutions. Some quick ground rules to cover. The presentation is targeted for 45 to 60 minutes. We always encourage your participation. If you identify yourself with a topic or question, if you have a best practice you'd like to share, raise your hand or use the chat box there on the right-hand side, and we're going to open the floor to you. We will be emailing a copy of this presentation with a link to both the recording and the presentation by the end of this week. And it's just important to remember that this is not a rehearsed presentation. We're busy over here, just like yourselves. Put together a great presentation. I'm excited about today's huddle. I think it's going to be a little bit more conversational, so please join in with us. And I'm excited to introduce today's Strategy Huddle leaders, and that's going to be Erica and Cammie. It's strategic planning season, and both of their plates are full. They're on the road with a lot of great, outstanding customers that we're working with. But like I said, it is strategic planning season. They do have full plates with that. But they are busy, but just as eager to share and participate and lead today's Strategy Huddle. Erica is a co-founder with M3 Planning, which is the parent company of MyStrategicPlan, and really the brains and intellectual property behind the system. She is the VP of Marketing, the author of Strategic Planning for Dummies, and has several spot training videos on both MyStrategicPlan as well as a bunch of them up there on YouTube. Cammie is one of our senior account managers on our professional service side of the business, and she really has a strong background in the research side. One of the areas that she heads up is the Net Promoter Score. She also has 15 years plus communication-based expertise in brand management, which she leverages in the strategic plan implementation and forming internal alignments to fulfill the expectations of the internal and the external stakeholders. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn this call over to Erica, and we're going to get the huddle started.
Hey, good morning, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you today. Good morning, Cammie.
Good morning.
We're excited, as Ryan said, to be here today with everyone. And Cammie and I, as we were preparing for our presentation, we're really planning on sharing the success stories and things that we do in setting up for our retreats, post-facilitation, post-retreat, all the things that we've found that have been successful so that you can go and make them work in your organizations or for your clients. So, again, kind of as Ryan mentioned, I think today is going to be quite a bit more conversational, and things are going to come to us, of course, as we're going along. But as Ryan mentioned, we're knee-deep in working with a bunch of our clients right now. And I know, Cammie, you're going to have a bunch of fun stuff to share just from last week, I would imagine, and myself too. So we're just looking forward to walking through the key items on the agenda. So let's look at the agenda. We almost titled the session today, Facilitating Your Own Retreat on the Cheap, and we decided, well, that might not be so apropos, but what we're trying to make sure that we focus on today is what you need to do to facilitate your own strategic planning retreat, where you need to be focusing your time and resources, and where maybe you don't, and certainly it's not a one-size-fits-all. So what we're going to do is walk through assessing your readiness, and again, we're really practical as we always are. So just some quick assessment of making sure that you're ready. So that's the first agenda item. The second one, after the strategy stat, is who needs to be involved when. That's something we get asked a lot, so we just wanted to share a little bit about that. And following that, we'll talk about how to set an effective agenda. So we're not going to be prescriptive about that, but again, just give you some tips about how we do agenda setting. And then a big thing that we do a lot of focus on is there's always a lot of energy going into a retreat. How do you maintain the momentum coming out of a retreat, moving from flip charts to putting your plan into action? And then, if you are really looking at budget cuts right now, which a lot of people are, of course, how do you facilitate and participate in a retreat at the same time? And certainly that's not ideal, but it is what some folks have to do right now, so we'll give you some ideas about that. And then, of course, anything else you all would like to talk about. As Ryan mentioned, we have a lot of folks on the call today, and we would love to hear your best practices and what you've seen work in these different areas as well. So please raise your hand with the little button that's in the bottom right-hand side, or pop them in the chat box, and we'll certainly, we'd love to have your conversation as we're going through. So with that, let's jump into the strategy stat of the month. This came across my email this week. I just love, or maybe it was last week. I just love this strategy stat. Managers spend 50% or more of their time in meetings, and research shows that 2/3 of meetings end before participants can make important decisions. And I just think that's a great thing to have in the back of our mind. Numbers aside for just a minute, really looking at your retreat and thinking about your agenda and thinking about what is it that you're going into the meeting to make decisions on. What are you maybe going in to just brainstorm, and what are you going into a retreat just to inform? And I think being really clear, this is just sort of a point we'll make further on, but be really clear about what your outcome is, and if it's decision making sure that you're really clear about what what the decision is coming out. So that's something that we focus a lot on, and I just love this stat because it backs it up. So with that, Cammie, let's jump into the first agenda item, which is assessing your readiness. Take it away.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, so and just a note on that strategy stat, it's really important from an outcomes perspective to have that in your head as you go through a facilitation. It will help guide you, and it will help lead you in a very streamlined way to try to direct your facilitation towards an end that you're trying to achieve, versus allowing this facilitation to lead the process and lead the outcome. Because as you might expect, with a lot of people in a room trying to make decisions for something 5 years down the road, paths can get a little divergent. So that's a great stat. In getting ready for a facilitation, there's a readiness survey actually that we have. If we can move the slide on. This is just, everyone's going to be getting the PowerPoint after this presentation, but these are just, some checkpoints that we have before we go into a facilitation that we usually vet out completely with the client before we begin. And perhaps one of the most important ones is right up on top, to have the commitment and support from top leadership. And it gets a little harder, especially when you have a variety of people that are in power positions. Maybe you're an organization that is led by a board. You're an organization that has a shared leadership responsibility at the top tier. Having the commitment from everyone and the cohesion that represents from a leadership perspective is really important, because all it would take is one of those people to question the importance of what you're trying to do, and it begins to erode the support throughout the organization accordingly. So, leadership is everything. We know that much, and it continues through with the way that you need to have support to go into a facilitation. Another thing to consider is that look at the timing on what you're doing. Do you expect big changes in your leadership? Perhaps you're, like, for example, a municipality, and you have elections coming up. We ran into this recently, and we know that there is going to be a big shift in one of our clients' worlds because of elections. And what does that do to your strategic planning process? What kind of accommodations do you need to make sure that your work is bridged somehow to new leaders that might be coming in, or perhaps it's even better just to wait until this change in leadership occurs and then do a facilitation. So timing is really critical. Some of our clients are in the midst of hiring other executives to come in. We had one client who had a new finance executive that was getting on board. We had to delay the process to start our facilitation for that. It's those kind of examples that you want to be cognizant of when you're scheduling the time to do this. Also, an understanding from that same top leadership core that the facilitation needs broad participation. This is particularly important for organizations that might be more top-driven. And this is, there's a lot of forework that goes into a facilitation, and this is one of those things that you want to communicate clearly to top leaders that will be participating on the importance of making sure that they help foster the environment. So that's not really what some leaders are used to doing. So it really does need to be stated beforehand, and that is the importance of sharing the facilitation agenda beforehand with the leadership so they understand what you're trying to get out of it. Again, back to that strategy stat, making sure that leaders are on board with what you're trying to do will help them play the appropriate role that they should be playing during your retreat. Also, when you're making a consideration on who should participate, obviously you don't want to have the whole company there if you're a mid-sized company or even a small company. What you need is just a well-rounded team, the big picture thinkers, the subject matter experts, the people from, good representatives from perhaps maybe the top 2-3 tiers of your organization if you're structured that way, but making sure that it is well-rounded, because in the end, the ability for strategic plans to be implemented from an organizational perspective is going to be broad-based buy-in. And the best way to achieve broad-based buy-in is to make sure that these people are a part of or represented in your retreats. So that's a very important point, because you want this work to continue on. You want it to be a guiding force, and the way to do that is to get maximum buy-in. So please consider that when you're assembling the folks that will participate. And finally, with this survey and just sort of, taking this 30,000-foot overview that we are right now, is, making sure that everyone's understand the purpose of the planning. A lot of people that we run into are new to the strategic planning process, and they need a framework of understanding, how this exercise will feed into ultimately a strategic plan. And once you have people on board with that, they're a little more apt to participate in a meaningful way, and not necessarily be skeptical if that is part of the culture that you have to deal with in your organization. So making sure that everyone understands the purpose is a great start. Go ahead, E.
Kenny, I was just going to mention on that point too. One of the things that I've been talking a lot about right now with one of our clients is sort of I think we need to paint the picture as the strategic planning managers or the people who are leading the planning process, everybody that's on the phone today, is, what's going to be different about the organization after we have invested all this time and money in putting a strategic plan together and putting this business process in place. And I think we talk a lot about outcomes, but I really mean, what do we expect to see that's different? And I think that's important, especially when you're trying to get that commitment that you were just chatting about why are we going to invest this time in this process? How is it going to help my job? And I think that's a great thing to do. And I wanted to mention the other thing on the bottom of this survey. It says, we want to grow our organization, and certainly, in today's economy, sometimes you want to say, well, we'd like to maintain our organization, and that's fine. But you might even put after that, is there a burning platform? And I know that comes from a really horrible analogy from actually having a burning platform, really. But, what is the burning platform for you to actually jump into a strategic planning process? What is it that's compelling your organization to do this? Not just because it sounds good and because we're supposed to be doing it, but that burning platform. If you have one that's compelling and everybody's on that platform together, your need to convince folks to invest in this process is quite a bit more curtailed. So anyway, just a couple of things to add on. Yep, go right ahead. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when people understand that something that needs to be addressed will be addressed in this type of forum, as far as, optimizing what your organization is all about, because, that's what it is, people really get jazzed about it too. And it's a great way to approach that. So those are great points. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide and what to consider if you're not ready. Perhaps it's a abbreviated process approach, picking maybe one or two strategic initiatives that you know need to be addressed in order to make your organization strong and viable for the future. In that kind of an exercise, what's really good about that is that when you start building towards an initiative, you do start to, chop away at the bigger issue or the issues that you need to for a full-blown strategic plan. What are your strengths in order to achieve this initiative? What are some of the weaknesses you might have to overcome? And as you do that, as you exercise through that initiative
process, you will start to build a broader platform for addressing things that need to be addressed from a long-term perspective. So that's a great way to do it. And also, just by building the internal support for why strategic planning is important, that is, that segues right back to what Erica was just talking about, the burning platform that needs to be addressed. Knowing that the strategic plan is a good way to make organizations more responsive to its customers, have organizations commit to better processes, being able to have an organization that delivers for its people, that works for, that are underneath your organizational structure. So understanding how strategic planning enhances an organization from a processes and a customer and a people and learning perspective, ultimately, contributes to the bottom line and makes financial sense as well. So, Erica, in your experience, when organizations come to us, because Erica's been doing this a number of years, when they're not ready, what else have you seen with organizations and how they position themselves in being able to bridge that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was sitting here thinking about that as well, and I think it takes a pretty big person, or sometimes it's hard for us as well to say, hey, we're not going to continue. You guys aren't ready. You're not in an organizational state of readiness. We're going to hold until X, Y, Z is covered. And so I've found when we're brave enough to say that, and I think everybody on the phone would agree with this, when we're brave enough to say that, we're certainly cutting off a potentially really long process or something that might not be as successful. And I just have to say that there's one client that we're working with right now that I think if we would have been able to assess their readiness a little bit better, and what I mean by that is, all the things that Cammie talked about before, the leadership commitment wasn't there. There wasn't really a burning platform. There wasn't shared consensus and agreement on the outcomes. And so consequently, we're in this very prolonged process. And it's really painful, and we've probably all been part of that. So that I think, so that's what we should have done is just stopped altogether and fixed some of those organizational development challenges. And I think that means that we're focusing and working on the organization differently. And I know that we have and Ryan just moved to the next agenda item. I think we probably can wrap on that. But hopefully there are some tips and tricks in there for everybody on, assessing your readiness. And just the last point is that the survey is not meant to, add up to something and give you a score. It's just as a way to make you think through, okay, should we stop or should we go? And if you stop, the tips on the other side, those are some other things that you can do. Okay, let's talk about who needs to be involved when. So we have our overall planning process put together, which is on the next slide. And this is something that we've been using a lot lately. It's just a 6-step process, and this is really a best practice process that we've synthesized down to be really linear and straightforward. And I'm not going to go through all the boxes that are on the screen. What I wanted to do is just highlight those 6 steps, and the next slide will show us who needs to be involved in which part of each step or each of the phases. So looking at that, I think what's important to note is, we don't need everybody involved all of the time, but, Cammie, to your point, the deftness of our work is how do we get people at the table with them not actually necessarily sitting at the table? Not because, and people ask me this too, it's like, why do I don't really care what my line staff thinks about the strategic direction of the organization. They don't know, they don't think about strategy, and I know that's a little crass to say, but we do hear that sometimes. And my response always back to that is, well, that's true, maybe you're right, but in our experience, we don't necessarily, if you don't care what they have to say, what we care about is that initial engagement up front so that when we get to execution, people feel like their DNA is part of the plan. So you always hear us talk about that a lot. So with that in mind, kind of looking at these different phases, you can kind of see who we've identified in each one of these steps. And so I just want to point out a couple of things, and again, these slides would be yours after the fact, and so you can read them later. But certainly the key points at the beginning with, the getting started and phase 1 is really the idea of the decision makers in the room to really set the key strategic direction and purpose. so that happens in those first couple of phases. And then, we widen the circle a little bit when we come into the assess your strategic position, which is all of our SWOT work. And you can see added in there department managers and all staff. And, one way to get them involved is through a survey process, of course. And then, we shrink the group back down to move into key decision-making after we have information about our strategic position, so that we actually do have just the executive staff. Maybe, and what's not on here, maybe you're bringing in an outside expert in this place. Kind of depends how big your process is. The planning team, sometimes the planning team is the executive team. Sometimes organizations have a sort of an ad hoc a team of maybe sort of key staff members from different parts of the organization. So that's why that planning team is listed there. And then, of course, once we go from setting the corporate level strategy, cascading it down into operations, that, of course, expands it back out to the department managers and then all the way down to the line staff in Phase 4, and then, of course, all the way into Phase 6. So Phase 5, is that little bit of that people and finance discussion, so bringing in expertise from finance and HR into the planning discussion is an addition of some folks there. So kind of an important thing to think about here is, you could do this in a really long 3 to 6 month process, or maybe you're going to do several of these phases in 2 days. And that's up to you and your organization how fast you want to work through putting a plan together. But these are just some different ways to think about when you need to pull in whom and how you might do that, as noted, whether they're at the table or you're doing it via a survey or, whatever the case may be. So, Cami, any examples you want to share related to who to get at the planning table when?
Yeah. Well, I think that specifically with the importance. I know with a smaller group, it's always easier to be able to address what you need to address from a strategic perspective. But just back to Erica's point a bit about the people piece and getting the staff involved to some degree. It's really important from an assessment perspective to have them well represented, because the people piece of your strategic plan is extremely important to making sure that people have the tools and the skills and feel like that they have the support that they need to do a good job for you. So in addition, to being able to have everyone's, DNA on this, it's really important from a foundational perspective to get those people involved, not necessarily sitting during the retreat, but certainly during some kind of an assessment and discovery phase. Another thing that I was just thinking about is that, these are very much roles that exist already within organizational structures, but just as consideration, when you are embarking on a strategic planning facilitation, try to make sure that you have 3 key roles fulfilled, that you have someone who is a key sponsor of the initiative, ideally that should be the CEO. Also that you have a champion, and I have a feeling that that's who we have on the call right now, are those strategic champions, but someone also in a leadership position that would speak to the importance of it in a very practical perspective. And then someone from a strategic administrator role, and this is the person who would participate in your facilitation, that would be responsible for being the touch person, the project initiator, after all of this is done, that everyone sees as a go-to person for, just advice on, from an administrative perspective, how to keep strategy alive. And those are the key things I'd like to add on this one.
And your last point on that is kind of that strategic plan manager that's listed. Was listed through here, was it? Or strategic planning leader, sorry. But that was your point, right, about the person that's kind of they're almost acting maybe in a little bit of an administrative role to man, and a process owner role to actually manage the process
yes.
from end to end. Yeah, I absolutely agree. One pitfall that I think is an interesting thing to kind of throw in here is, when we don't have that leadership representation or commitment, do you move forward or don't you? And we've talked about that a lot on the huddles in the past, and I'm not going to spend any time there right now, but there are times when that CEO or that champion, as Cami just mentioned, can't be at the table, and what do you do when you're trying to have one of these meetings that he or she can't be there? And I just had one of those experiences a couple of months ago, and my rule is to absolutely never, ever have a strategy session without the CEO or the champion. We went ahead and did it anyways, and it was it ended up being a great meeting, and I'm sure everyone can kind of think about it in their own minds about how that might go for you if your CEO is not in the room, or if you are the CEO if you're not in the room, due to external circumstances. And I think what's interesting about it is, we certainly, did a completely different agenda on the fly because there were decisions that we needed to make that, the CEO wasn't there for. It certainly allowed for different level of conversation, but we, of course, ended up having the strategic planning meeting all over again when he was available to join us. So I do think that not everybody listed in each of these areas is mission critical. There are some mission critical people, and your identification of those in advance, of course, is a really important thing to keep your process going. So with that, let's jump into how we set an effective agenda. So I think one thing that we do a lot in our organization, we spend a lot of time on agenda setting. And, two sides to this. One is it's the right thing to do to run an effective meeting. Okay, that's fine. But the more important thing about it is back to what, Cami, you mentioned earlier about the consensus and commitment and the understanding of everybody going into the meeting about what we're actually really doing. And one thing so that's why we spend a lot of time on the agenda. And yes, of course, we have time blocks for how much time we're going to spend in each area. And, oftentimes we'll walk into the meeting and the agenda for me as a facilitator helps me think about how each part of the meeting is connecting or the information is flowing from one piece to the next because, the difference between a strategic planning session and a regular meeting is the connectivity and we're going from a lot of information down to a set of smaller information and then eventually making decisions based on that smaller information. And there's some art to making that happen. And if you have a really good agenda, whether anybody else looks at it, contradicting what I just said earlier, but even if nobody else looks at it, you have at least thought through the entire day or series of days so you understand how the whole thing is going to flow and how all the information is going to flow. So that's why we put so much importance on the agenda. And then really, of course, that people have a true understanding walking into the day about what we are and conversely what we're not going to do. So let's talk about these key tips that are on the screen right here. I'm not going to share an actual agenda just because they're always different, so it's for you to make up your own, but I think these tips will certainly help. So the first one is, start with the outcomes first. So you hear me talk a lot about outcomes, but this is something that Cami and I learned from one of our facilitation mentors, which is, don't just go into, this agenda item, this agenda item, this agenda item. Step back for a minute and think again, by the end of the meeting, what are the key outcomes that we're looking for? And a key outcome is not, have a vision statement. A key outcome would be consensus around and clarity around the strategic direction of the organization, which looks like a vision statement, and a vision statement is an agenda item, but the outcome is different than a vision statement. The outcome is consensus, commitment, clarity around the future direction of the organization, for example. Another outcome would be a clear set of, a short list of clear priorities at the corporate level for the next 2 years. Okay, that's a good outcome. And then we build our agenda based on that to achieve those outcomes. The other reason that we do that as well is, and this has probably happened to some of us on the phone, you walk into the day and you may be really well prepped, you've got a great agenda, and like my other example, the CEO doesn't show up. That agenda just got thrown out the door, and I grabbed a couple of the outcomes and I redid the agenda on the fly because I knew what we were trying to drive at, but the agenda that I had built coming in wasn't the right agenda to achieve those outcomes given the fact that we were missing a key person. So that's another reason to have the outcomes when you're in the middle of the meeting and the flow is not working right. You can at least get to the outcomes. Maybe you're going to get there differently. So that's really important. The other thing, and this is just a super easy way to structure your strategic planning retreat agenda, which is, where are we now? That's section number 1. So that's your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, our current position discussion. Where are we going? That would be the vision discussion. And how are we going to get there, goals and actions and objectives. So people really like that flow, and that really helps as well if you have an organization that doesn't have a lot of competency in planning, and that's fine. That is, Cami's point earlier about everybody else understanding what we're doing. That's a pretty simple structure to structure an agenda off of. The other thing, and I love this, and I borrowed this from somebody else, and I can't remember her name right now, but I just love the idea of, thinking about your goal setting, and this may work for you, this may be confusing, but, when you get into that goal setting, how are we going to get there? That is that goal setting area, and sometimes we get a little stuck. It's like, okay, well, what are our 2011 goals? Like, okay, I don't know. That feels, you just look at a blank piece of paper sometimes, and it's like, I like to kind of think about them in buckets. Incremental, which might be in the next 12 to 24 months. Substantive might be a little bit more midterm, 24, 36. and transformational, maybe a little bit more, take a little bit longer to get to. And, we can also call those different planning terms, but it's kind of a nice way, and it frees up people's thinking a little bit, like what are some incremental things we need to do? What are some substantive things we need to do? What are some transformational things we might be considering? And, again, that's just a kind of a fun way to think about goal setting. The other item, and I mentioned that as well, and that when I'm talking about time frames here, I meant time frames for the agenda. It's helpful for you to think about how long you think the conversation is going to take, but my rule of thumb is always it'll take as long as it's going to take, and we're going to make choices in the middle of our retreat, based on whether or not we actually came to a decision, if it was a decision point or if it wasn't, and we're going to take the time we need to get there, and we're going to make choices about what we're not going to cover. So I mentioned that as well-clarified decisions. Cami and I and everybody in our organization, when we facilitate a retreat, we always have someone, whether it's a client or one of us, capturing the discussion in the room, and we do it to different and varying degrees, but at minimum, stopping every so often to make sure if someone's capturing the information that the decisions are clarified, or you're clarifying the decisions on a flip chart. But I've found oftentimes we forget very quickly what we thought we came to decision on, so I think that's a really important point. And then this is something that is really worked well for us. We call it the pre-work, but it is prepping the information in advance that you will need to make decisions while you're in the meeting. So when you're putting your agenda together, oftentimes in my agenda, I'll have a little italicized thing underneath each agenda item that says outcome. And what is the outcome I'm seeking for that specific agenda item? Of course, it ties back to those larger outcomes, but with a mission statement, it's like, okay, we're actually looking for a specific mission statement written fully, or is the outcome just to get people's feedback on what the mission might sound like, and we're going to go do that offline. So if that's the point, whatever you're trying to get out of that, what information do we need for that agenda item that you can pre-prep to help the conversation go more smoothly? That works for us every time. So every time we look at our agendas, we're always going through it, going, okay, what information do we need to have ready to go in order to make that agenda item go smoothly? Oh, we need a couple of mission statements, pre-prepped and built out for people to think about. Okay, fine, so then we'll pre-prep some mission statements. And I'm just picking on that, but those are some things that we have found that have been really, really successful. So that was a lot of information. Cami, what do you have to add from your experience on agenda setting?
Just taking it from the fact that a lot of times agendas they don't stay on a timetable per se. So sometimes it's better to set an itinerary versus a timeline-oriented agenda. To know yourself what you have to shoot for in time, that's always good. But an itinerary approach is also helpful because a lot of times, one topic will take a lot longer, and particularly if it's a topic that brings up something that could be a source of contention, it's not as if you need to take this time to focus on that. In fact, you shouldn't. But if anything, you do have to acknowledge those pain points, capture them, and that is why the person doing some kind of a recording is really good to have. Capture those thoughts, make sure that it's well represented in the capturing, and then move the agenda along, move the itinerary along. So it's good to actually physically, when something like that is going on, move away from your presentation spot. Acknowledge that this is a divergent path, capture the essence of it, wrap it back up, put a little bow on it, and move on. So people are acknowledged. They know that they've been heard, they know that it's been captured, and then you can get to the larger topics of the day, because these sessions, you're talking about strengths and weaknesses and threats and where you want to be, away 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road. So sometimes, that can bring a whole host of issues onto the plate, and knowing how you're going to capture that throughout the day is just a good thing to keep in mind to keep it on track.
Cami, that reminds me of something, and I'll just add this last point on this item is, so we have an agenda, oftentimes in front of us, a piece of paper, and one thing that I've been doing a little bit lately is creating a visual agenda. So when people walk into the room, you have your flip charts prepped or your whiteboards, if you're lucky enough to have, round the room whiteboards, so that you have a heading of each of your agenda items up on the wall, and I even number them, even if they're not sequential. in order, like from left to right or whatever, but I'll put them up on the wall so that when you're starting to work in a particular area, and I'm just going to stay on mission statement for a second, and all the work on mission statements under this heading that says mission statement has got a number 1 on it because it's the first agenda item, and you're working right there, and then you move to the next one, and that really has worked well for connecting people with how the day is going to work, and also keeps me on track, frankly, as well. And it gets back to the whole idea of not losing people along the way, especially if they're kind of trying to figure out how did that conversation tie to the next one. So really great tip that's worked well for me. So can you talk to us about the day after our retreat? What happened?
Yeah. Well, you think you'd be able to sleep in, but you really can't because you have a lot of work to do. But, part of it is just very first off, knowing that you need to get back to those notes and clarify anything that has been captured to make sure that, the shorthand that's being used is definitely meaningful to you. And a lot of times things happen so fast, and it's really good to do that immediately. Another thing is to, as you're doing that, you're speed. You're capturing those details. You're wrapping them up so you can have a follow-up meeting with the strategic sponsor and champion. So they know what you've captured. They feel good about it. They know that you've captured the essence of the robust conversations that took place. And that's really important, just to make sure that everything that's going on the key stakeholders' heads have been captured with what you're doing, and if they haven't, you have a chance to do that by having a follow-up meeting soon after. Also, just to review and revise some of the decisions that were made in the strategic planning session, just to make sure that, again, with the leadership, that those decisions were in fact, representative of the intent of the conversation. And sometimes it takes just a little bit of time to sit on it and think about it, and specifically from a leadership perspective, because sometimes there's a lot of perspectives for leaders to take into consideration, and so in doing that, to revise the decisions accordingly is a good exercise. Also, again, that the business process owner, maybe you call this person the strategic administrator, someone that will be in charge of putting in place the system and the schedule for your continued visits back to the strategic plan. This is the person who will be driving the implementation of your strategy from an administrative standpoint, making sure it's on everyone's calendars, making sure that everyone's getting the agenda, making sure that any report templates that your organization wants to use are well distributed. So everyone's comparing apples to apples, and everyone's coming to the table at the same time. So that person is really important to getting all this into an actionable schedule, routine, what you might need to make sure that this time is well spent and additive to your future. Again, the strategy reviews are something that need to occur. Sometimes it might be once a month for organizations that are in some, just routine change, routine external environment types of, influences that need to be addressed. Some companies do this quarterly. It just depends on the pace of business of your organization. But these strategy reviews are an important time because it allows people to take a look at the strategy, see what seems to be moving well, see what seems to be not moving so well, identify why, and these are really key meetings because if change is warranted in your strategic approach, these are the meetings where it becomes to get vetted. There's a lot of talk, or there has been in the past, about strategy being dead. That there is no time. Things are moving too rapidly. Having a strategic plan is more of an anchor than it is a tool, which that is what the strategic review is all about. Your organization has to commit to these because it is the only way that strategic plans stay viable and relevant to your organization. So in knowing that, just make sure that those strategic reviews are attended and are a priority for your leadership. Really important. And in closing the loop, what I mean that to be is that as soon as the strategic facilitation takes place and you're able to wrap everything in and the leadership says, yeah, I feel really good about what this is, and the next step needs to be that a revision to the organization is sent out. So the people that have participated, or they know that they were heard, they know that it was captured, and in closing the loop, that information about the system and the schedules and the strategic review, all of that is contained with that communication, because in that way people know that their time was valued, that they were heard, and that something is actually occurring. What do you think about this, Ian, closing the loop?
Yeah, and I just think that is something, as we get so busy, oftentimes we do a really good job as organizations prepping for retreats, and probably a lot of you on the line right now are, knee deep in that. And I just think it's that we get back to the business of the day. We're out for 2 days, and there's so much to get done, and it's really hard to get back to the retreat, what came out of the retreat, and then communicating that out to a broader organization. And I'll just speak for our organization. The Cobbler's Children sort of have shoes. We did our own retreat in September, and we're still struggling with having a refined plan and looking back at it again with everybody and reviewing what we decided and getting ready more effectively for 2011. So we're a small organization, so closing the loop is a little bit easier, but nonetheless, not a lot of people have kind of been asking, like, well, what happened? What came of all the stuff that we did? And I think that our job as everybody on the phone today is to say, okay, well, the retreat is a point in time. If you want it to be a point in time exercise, then acknowledge that and don't worry about some of this larger process stuff that we're talking about right now. But if you don't want it just to be a point in time exercise and you want it to have lasting effects in the organization and that the plan actually works for you, Cami, like you were talking about it not being dead, then that communication piece about, okay, so keeping that momentum going, honoring everybody that was involved, letting people know what was decided, talking about what is expected to come out of the effort, and then when are we going to hear about it again? And I think it's hard when you don't have a person in the organization. That goes back to having that business process owner, that strategic plan manager who has their eye on the ball to say, we just had a retreat 2 weeks ago and mum's the word, no one's heard anything. Or, hey, it's been 3 months and we said we would communicate out to larger org what happened, and we haven't done that yet. And so I just think having that person's eye on it is really important, and that may be you. So those are kind of the key things, I think, just the communication piece, booking the strategy review sessions, back to Cammie's point on that, and I'm just kind of going up the list as well here, having somebody who owns the process, making sure that you commit to the decisions, and then really just have a follow-up meeting. We just did that recently with one of our clients. It was awesome. So we had already booked it. We came back 1 week later and said, hey, we talked about all this stuff. Here are the rough notes. Are we all in agreement? Yeah, we're in agreement. Great. And that really set us up for a really successful engagement post-retreat with them. So that's another really cool thing to do. So with that, let's move on to the next agenda item in the time that we have left, and that is, how do you facilitate your own strategic planning retreat? And people ask us that a lot, and we do that for ourselves too. And we don't have bullet points. I just had some pictures here because I thought it was interesting as an individual. It was kind of a good example of what do you do when you're up in front of the flip chart and when you're then also participating in a small group. So I just want to share a couple of ideas. So one thing that you can do, and this is what we did as well actually in our retreat, is rotate the facilitators. So I don't know that everybody on the phone today and the leadership always needs to feel responsibility for having to be in front of the room all the time. And so one easy way to do it is to let a different person who's going to be at your retreat facilitate a section. So that's kind of fun. There's some continuity problems with that. It's not perfect, but it certainly gets you to your retreat, gets you to a plan, and maybe it fits better in your budget. If that doesn't sound good, what do you do as yourself, perhaps the CEO or one of the leadership team members facilitating the retreat, but you also have a functional role in the organization? So one suggestion that I have about that is, and I actually do this, you could literally actually have a hat, but sometimes we'll say, okay, I'm taking off, and think about what role you're playing and put on the hat of the role that you're playing. So you play the facilitator role. Then if you're playing the facilitator role, put on facilitator hat and shut your mouth about any sort of opinions that you have. And I know, we all know, oh yeah, we need to do that, but it can be really hard to bite your tongue. And Cammie has some advice on a way to make sure that your ideas are in the mix, but not necessarily coming from you. So we'll get to that in a minute. But certainly put on a facilitator hat and stick there. And I know I have a hard time with that when I'm facilitating my own retreat. But that's really, really important. And then, if you're going to switch gears for a second, put on that functional role hat or your expert hat. That's certainly a different role, and be really clear with everybody that that's, you're now speaking from a different perspective. And then thirdly, the third role or the third hat that you might have is just a straight-up participant. So you may just be wanting to contribute an idea or something out of left field, and it's just a participation, role. So think about those three roles: the facilitator role, the expert role, and the participant role. And if you're facilitating, be really clear with yourself, either visually or auditorially, what role you're in at that point in time. And I do think that certainly the hardest part about facilitating your own retreat is, especially if you're a part of the executive team, the organization needs your thinking on a particular topic. And so for you to facilitate, that means you're taking yourself out of that information flow, and you're intentionally doing so, and I think that can be really hard. And then lastly, on that point too, is, when you're being a facilitator, and we all know this, is, your responsibility is to honor everybody else's opinions and ideas and not pass judgment. And that means you have the power of the pen, so you write down and you flip chart down everything everybody says, even if you don't agree with it. And I know that can be challenging, but I think that's also a really good kind of reminder to yourself to say, that's right, I'm facilitating. I'm not making a judgment call. So, Cammie, tell us how we get our opinions in the mix without them coming out of our own mouth.
Yeah, well, a lot of times if you have someone that you work closely with, maybe it's, an assistant in your department or a peer, in these exercises when you're facilitating, when the exercises are taking place, there's opportunity for you just to go check in with that person and let them serve as your proxy to some degree. You're the one who's controlling the exercise. You know what you're trying to get out of it. If you could just, briefly, talk to the person who is your proxy about where you're coming from, allow them to represent you, and then continue on around the room and do what you need to do from a facilitation standpoint. So that's one way to address it. And another thing that, if you are going to go ahead and have different people come up to lead different parts of the day, I think that, one of our mentors has taught us well in that when you're doing the exercises, communicating, what you need to do, how you might go about it, and why you're doing a certain exercise is always a good thing for people who just aren't used to doing facilitations. If you're asking them to lead people through a prioritization exercise, just having that discussion of what they need to do, how they might do it, and why they are doing that certain exercise will help guide them in doing this, which could be an awkward role for them initially, but giving them some parameters around how to go about it would be really helpful for them as well. But,
that's a great tip. I love that tip. We use that all the time. Yeah. So with that, maybe we'll wrap on a couple of just kind of on the high points. I'm just going to walk through what we covered, and then I'll turn it over to Cammie, and then we'll take your questions. So we started off, of course, talking about assessing your readiness. So the tip and takeaway point on that is really use that survey and the other ideas that we shared to say, are we ready? Have we covered all the key pieces that we need to be thinking about before we start planning, and not being afraid to say no. The next thing we talked about, of course, is just being clear about who needs to be at the table when. And thinking all the way through that, I think, is really, really helpful. And, you may be in the middle of your process, so that might have already been too far gone. But then, of course, thinking about who needs to be at your retreat is always a really good question that, a lot of people ask us about. So you have those suggestions in that table that was shared in that section. Setting an effective agenda, key takeaway that you heard us talk about there was just being really clear about the outcomes. how do you move from the retreat to putting your plan in action? I think really a key takeaway on that as well is that concept of keeping your plan alive and how you keep your plan alive with strategy review sessions and really getting the information back to everybody from the retreat as quickly as possible. And then the last item, of course, is facilitating yourself. You heard some good ideas about how to facilitate. Really think about the hats, think about having a proxy, think about whether it's really right for you to facilitate it. And one thing we didn't say is, maybe you do need to have an outside facilitator and weigh the pros and cons of that. So, Cami, anything you'd like to add on some key takeaway points that we covered?
No, I think you covered them all really well. And, there's a lot of resources out there. We use the balanced scorecard approach to our strategic planning. So if you don't really know how you want to structure the day and the outcome specifically with what you're trying to get at as far as the plan goes and how it's structured, check out the balanced scorecard approach. Kaplan and Norton. There's the Harvard Business Review is a great resource. Just go ahead and go to their website, type in strategy. Or, of course, we've got a ton of resources on our website at MyStrategicPlan, including a lot of videos that could be helpful. So, just with a little bit of homework, I think that if it sounds daunting to you now, you'll quickly find that there's a lot of structure out there and there's a lot of guidance that is available. So good luck with continuing that on.
And Cami just wrote a great newsletter last week, and you can certainly go to our newsletter section and find it on, what did we title it, 8 Ways to Ruin Your Strategic Planning Retreat? 6 ways?
I think we had to knock it down to 5. They're there.
A little bit different of a tack, but also very fun. 5 things not to do. So with that, Ryan, anybody, any questions from folks that are on the phone, either via chat or?
We have a handful of questions that came in, and by all means, if you have any questions that come to mind right now, go ahead and type them in the box or raise your hand. We can open the floor. Well, the first question I'll read, kind of put them in the order that they came in. It's a long question, but I think it's a very good question. I'll read it here. The economy and the industry dynamics are forcing our hand. Our organization is new, brand new to strategic planning. I know we need to walk before we run, and I love all the articles and videos on your website, but going back to Section 3, I think it was today, what is a good outcome I should set for our first meeting agenda to get this moving forward? He's talking about the outcomes, and he did type in again and said that they do have the CEO buy-in, so they're clearing that first hurdle, but going back to outcomes, I thought that was a good question. Or is it? I don't know if it's too general that it kind of depends on company, but I thought it was a pretty good question. Just moving the ball forward for a lot of companies that are new to the process.
I'll share maybe a couple of ideas, and I'm sure Cami, you have some as well. I think it's a little hard to answer because it kind of it depends what we're really expecting to get out of the strategic planning process. So that goes back to maybe an earlier point that we made about readiness, is getting really clear, I think, about what you want to see different in your business because you have this instinct that you need to have a strategic plan. And so I think that if maybe going back to the CEO and the key leadership team and talking to everybody about, so let's pretend like we have one, and it's 12 months from now, and what's different in our business because we have decided to invest our time and energy in the strategic planning process and execution process. And so for you, Mr. or Mrs. CEO, and to each of the executive team members, what are your intended expectations and outcomes from this investment? So I think that kind of helps you frame what you need to be focusing on in the first meeting. So that is actually how I would approach it, because if they come back to you and say, well, because we need a clear vision, we need to know where we're going, and we don't have a clear picture of what that future state looks like. Well, now you know. We need to have the first bulk of the discussion needs to be on vision and prepping for that. If they come back and say, we need a tight list of priorities. We're all over the place. We need to know what we're doing for the next 6 months because we just need to prioritize our resources, and budgets are shifting, and we just need to know what the boss wants us to do. okay, then the first meeting needs to be about specifically hopping into goal setting and priority setting for the first 6 months. That's pretty short term. That's not like super strategic and super long term, but that doesn't matter if that's what people are thinking about with strategic planning. Now you know. So that's what I would do if that was where I found myself in your process. Cammie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would also look towards an exercise like a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats type of exercise before. And again, with what Erica said, going out and talking to your key leadership, understanding where their opinions on as far as the SWOT goes, and that a lot of times that process is a discovery process, and it will allow you to have a little bit of insight into your opportunities, into some of the external environmental things that you guys hopefully can position yourself to be a stronger company to weather down the road. And that will, I think, is really helpful in shaping outcomes as far as the agenda goes.
That's a great idea. That is a great idea. So the first meeting you would do a SWOT, even if you don't have a ton of external information, just to get people's ideas up on the board around strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. I think that's great. Yeah. Ryan, how about do we have some more questions?
There's one other question. There's 3 people that typed in on the same one, and it actually goes back to the strategy. We call it the versatile strategy advisor, diagram. But 3 people asked about the strategy diagram and getting a printout. So the quick question, I'll give the answer and then hand it off to you. But this will be a part of the PowerPoint handout, so you will have the slide here. And then also for customers of My Strategic Plan on the Help tab, there is a version and a step-by-step approach there. But I'll give it to you, Derek, if there's anything you want to add to that answer.
That's just a kind of a cool diagram we put together recently as a way to really help be an effective communication tool to answer the questions for people about what are we trying to get done when in the planning process, what needs to come first and what needs to come second. And it is a process, it is a framework, and you could do things in a little bit differently of an order depending upon where you are in your organization. But if you don't want to think too hard about that, the process is pretty best practice in that regard, and it's been developed not only from, again, sucking in best practices from the industry, but from our experiences as well. So we're really finding a lot of success with that. And Cammie, I think you've been using it quite a bit as well in your communication with client organizations around what are we trying to get done in this process, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Absolutely. It's one of those documents as far as getting everyone on board of what strategic planning is about. It's very helpful in that regard for helping, get people up to speed about, what's going on so they can orient themselves accordingly.
Yeah, yeah.
We'll do,
so we recommend using it. Use it at will. So by all means.
To the top of the hour, we have another question here. We'll get this question answered, and then we'll wrap it up. This question is, when the meeting consensus is that the coming year is all about tactics, not strategy, how do you determine whether that consensus is reality or just avoidance of dealing with the tough strategy definition process?
Well, that's interesting. I think we definitely work with some organizations where we kind of, when we look at the planning process, all we're really doing is planning for the next 12 months, and you have to ask, and to the participant's question there or comment there, is that really strategic? And I think what is strategic to one organization is not necessarily strategic to another per se all the time. And so a classic definition of strategy would be that you're matching your competitive advantages to the market needs, and you have a view of how you're going to align your resources to find and execute against that specific position in the short, mid, and long term. So when we say, we're only planning for the next 12 months, that's not really strategic. I agree. I also think, though, sometimes organizations need to just get that going before you can push out to mid and push out to long. So my suggestion would be to say maybe there's some avoidance going on there, but also sometimes people actually just don't see the future that clearly. So can you get some clarity over the next 12 months that maybe feel a little tactical to you, and then in 6 months you say, okay, let's look at it a little further, and then 12 months, let's look at it a little further. And we've been doing that with a lot of our organizations right now, just kind of coaching through that to get people to see, okay, we've got some confidence in the next 12 months. Let's build past that. But I think organizationally sometimes that takes time, and I don't know if it's always avoidance or if it really truly is, looking past the next 12 months is too much of a guessing game. So I don't want to spend my time with that until you can start to show how you can have that little bit longer view, because you've shown some success in articulating the shorter term. So that was a long-winded answer, but that's my answer to that question. And I know we're over our time. So, Ryan, you want to close us?
Well, yeah, I will close this up then. Definitely appreciate everybody's participation today. If there's any follow-up questions that you have our email address here, admin@MyStrategicPlan. Go ahead and send those questions in. That relate to today. We could go ahead and get those answered. If you have some ideas for future strategy huddles, we always welcome those. That's what we try to drive the questions based upon what you're looking for. The next strategy huddle is actually going to be January 26th. We are going to be taking November and December off from the strategy huddle, that is. This strategy season, and it's also the holiday season, the fourth Wednesday of each month. So all of our huddle leaders will be working with our customers given this strategy season. So we appreciate your patience there. Hopefully a strategy season for you and everybody finds success with that. Again, cover that next point, send in questions for strategy huddle to admin. There, if you're interested in sharing or presenting any best practices as a strategy leader, whether it's just a 2-minute talking point, or you'd like to have, give you the floor for 10 minutes to talk about present a whole topic. If there's something that you find valuable in your organization that you have experience with, we'd love to have you participate as a leader. Just go ahead and drop us an email on that as well. Shameless plug, but we invite you to join us on Facebook and Twitter. We're always sending out a lot of information, letting you know those newsletters come out that Cami is writing, so they come to you there. And finally, we will be this session is recorded, so we will be sending out a link to this and the PowerPoint by end of week. We usually get that done today, if not by midday tomorrow. So again, we appreciate your time. Thank you, Eric and Cami, for leading us today and all your great insights.